So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's career conversation. This is an open Zoom call that we host each quarter for anyone who has specific questions about careers in the alternative protein space, or anyone who wants to learn more about navigating this field in general. My name is Christina Aguila, and I work as the University Innovation Specialist at the Good Food Institute. I joined GFI earlier this year, and before that, I worked as a process engineer in the biopharma space, where I worked in contract manufacturing and then in R&D. My formal education was in chemical engineering, and I became interested in the alternative protein space when I first learned about the harmful impacts of industrial animal agriculture on our planet. So at GFI, I'm focused on building up the workforce that's needed to support this protein transition. And this involves creating educational pathways for folks to enter the alternative protein field. So we tend to have a diverse group of attendees at these career webinars. Some of you are looking to enter the field as scientists, others are looking for non-technical roles. And then we also have a mix of students and folks who have already started their careers, perhaps in other industries. So with that all in mind, I will try my best to provide information for all of these different groups, but please don't hesitate to ask questions about your specific situation in the chat. And then just a few housekeeping notes before we dive in. This meeting is being recorded. Let me just triple check. Yes, it is being recorded. And since we're in webinar mode, it'll just be my camera and slides that show up in the recording. And then we'll post this recording to our YouTube channel, and we'll send this video link and the slides to all registered attendees. And I have a bunch of resources that are linked throughout the slide deck, so don't worry about copying those down or copying those links down, since the slides will hit your inboxes soon. Here is how this call will be structured. During the first 30 minutes or so, I'll give an overview of GFI and the alternative protein landscape, and I'll discuss relevant career fields and backgrounds, and then I'll share some career-related resources that are specifically for this field. This portion should hopefully address some of the most common questions that we get, and hopefully it gets us all onto the same page. And then with the remaining time, I'd love to answer your specific questions during a Q&A session. So with that, let's dive in. The Good Food Institute, or GFI, is an international nonprofit that's building a sustainable, healthy, and just global food system. So with unique insight across the scientific, policy, industry, and investment landscapes, we are using the power of food innovation and markets to accelerate the transition of the world's food system toward alternative proteins. And to do this, we focus on 3 key areas of work. I'm in our science and technology department, where we work to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. And our corporate engagement team builds relationships with the world's largest food manufacturers, restaurants, retailers, and even conventional meat companies to help them capitalize on opportunities in this space. And then our policy team advocates for the fair regulation of plant-based and cultivated meat, and also lobbies for government investment in sustainable protein R&D. What motivates our work is the fact that our current system for producing meat, dairy, and eggs is extremely unsustainable and inefficient. The system exacerbates climate change, environmental degradation, and antibiotic resistance, as well as global food insecurity and animal welfare. And despite more and more people learning about these issues, we're not seeing enough individuals changing the way they eat. Instead, per capita, meat consumption continues to rise globally. So GFI's theory of change is based on the idea that consumers will choose alternative proteins when they are as delicious, affordable, and accessible as animal products. So instead of asking consumers to give up the foods they love, we can instead make products that are just as tasty and affordable as conventional meats. These are a few different ways to produce alternative proteins. We can use plants, or we can use fermentation or microbes, or we can cultivate it from animal cells. So just so we're all on the same page with the terminology, I'm going to quickly explain each of these production platforms, starting with plant-based products. So to be clear, I'm not talking about tofu or those bright green veggie patties that look nothing like conventional burgers. When I refer to plant-based products, I'm referring to these next-gen products that actually cook, taste, and look like conventional meat while offering complex carbs and fiber, just like the Beyond Meat patty that's pictured here on this slide. Impossible and Beyond Meat are two of the big names in the plant-based sector, but there are plenty of other brands out there. If you see an alternative meat product at your local grocery store, chances are it's a plant-based product. And then cultivated meats, which is also known as cultured or cell-based meats, or sometimes clean meats. This is produced directly from animal cells. So in short, you start with a small sample of animal cells, and then you place it into a bioreactor, which contains the same conditions that you would find inside an animal, such as warmth, water, and basic nutrients. And then you can differentiate these into other types of cells and arrange them in a similar structure as animal tissues. And as a result, you can achieve a product that is genuine animal meat with the same sensory and nutritional profiles. There are dozens of cultivated meat companies around the world, but they haven't yet reached commercial scale production. Part of the challenge is scaling up these processes and bringing down the costs. And then on the policy side, many countries are still formalizing their regulatory requirements to approve cultivated meat for sale, since it's a new kind of food product. So as a result, cultivated meat is not sold in stores or restaurants yet, unless you're in Singapore, whose government was the first to approve these products. Lastly, we have fermentation, which is an enabling technology that allows for the production of standalone protein sources or functional ingredients. Microorganisms can be programmed to express specific proteins or fats, and then we can either isolate these proteins from the microbes to use as ingredients, or their entire protein biomass can be harvested. So what this means is that we can take plant-based and cultivated products to the next level with the aid of these fermentation-derived ingredients. It's important to note that in the future, we probably won't see these three production platforms as distinct industry segments like I just described, but rather as one large industry where we produce alternative protein products across a spectrum. For example, we often think of the Impossible Burger fitting neatly in the plant-based category, but it actually uses fermentation to produce the ingredient like hemoglobin, which gives it that bloody appearance and meaty taste. However, when we think about the different careers and relevant backgrounds in the alternative protein field, it can be useful to differentiate the three production platforms. So for those of you who are thinking of pursuing careers in science and technology, these are the different research areas to explore. So whether you're looking at plant-based, cultivated, fermentation-derived, or even conventional meat, the production process typically involves these stages. So to source is to choose your inputs, whether it's a plant or microbe or a sample of animal cells. And then you optimize through breeding, engineering, or cell culture conditions. Then you grow the cells, and then at the end, art and science come together to process these end products that have the desired taste, texture, smell, and appearance. And we need technological innovation at every stage in this process for all of the different production platforms in order to truly accelerate the alternative protein field. But when we zoom out and view the entire alternative protein ecosystem, we see a much greater diversity of roles that are not limited to science and technology. So the previous slide focused on research and development for inputs, production, and end products. However, we need investment to fund all of this research. And once we have the end products, we need to establish distribution channels that make these products truly accessible. And across all of these stages, we're depending on industry enablers such as the labor force, business services, and compliance to ensure that we're meeting regulatory requirements and producing food safely. So when people ask us questions like, what should I study in order to pursue a career in alternative proteins? You can start to see why the answer is that it depends. Each segment of this value chain employs many different roles that require varying skill sets. And on top of that, this is a new and growing industry. This means that some roles are more in demand now, and we expect other roles to be more in demand later. So now that we have a bit of context about the alternative protein landscape, now I'll move into which backgrounds are relevant for different career fields in the space at large. Alternative protein jobs exist across many sectors. I'll start with academia. If you are a scientist or someone in grad school, this is probably the most established or most familiar pathway. Research on alternative proteins is underway at universities around the world already. And getting a PhD would allow you to lead your own research group. Also with a PhD, you could become a faculty member and teach the next generation of talents. Increasingly, we're seeing alternative protein courses being offered at universities. And once we establish majors and full degree programs, there's going to be a greater need for instructors. There's also a need to train the manufacturing and agricultural labor force. In the United States, we often do this through extension programs that come out of four-year universities, such as well as career technical education programs through two-year institutions. And to instruct these types of training programs, a PhD isn't necessarily required. Rather, it depends more on industry experience, which brings me to the next sector, industry. The industry is composed of business to consumer or B2C companies, as well as business to business or B2B companies. Many of the B2C brands, like Impossible and Beyond Meat, you'll probably recognize those. But B2B companies are often less familiar to consumers. These B2B companies can include ingredient companies or manufacturing companies that design processing equipment, for example. So any company that supports companies in the alternative protein sector. And then also in industry, there's the option to create a startup or work at a startup. And there are a variety of companies that are still relatively new, but past that initial startup phase. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are established companies that are established in other industries and starting to get into the alternative protein space. So this includes established food companies, even some conventional meat companies, as well as companies in biotech, biopharma, and other life sciences. Many of the open positions in industry right now tend to be for PhD level scientists, but compared to academia, the industry does offer roles for a greater variety of backgrounds and education. So for instance, these companies need to fund all of their research and operations. So we need folks who can fill these finance and investor roles. And then the third sector is government, which again can include research in government labs. But alternatively, you can direct public funding into alternative protein research. One way to do this is to be a program leader for a government research funding agency like the NSF. Or if you're interested in policy, you can encourage policymakers to advocate for public funding, or you can be a policymaker who supports alternative protein. And then on the regulatory side, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of work to be done to approve cultivated meat for sale in most countries. Then last but not least, there are nonprofits like the Good Food Institute, which offer many ways to support the ecosystem at large. So for example, my work at GFI right now often involves supporting faculty members in academia who are building novel alternative protein courses. Some other nonprofits in this space include New Harvest, which is focused on cellular agriculture or cultivated meats, and also the Plant-based Foods Association. Coming back to that question of what should I study if I want to pursue an alternative protein career? Again, this depends on your interests because you'll be more motivated in a role that you find interesting. But if you've narrowed it down to careers in science and technology, then these are some areas of technical expertise that are needed by the industry. This is not a complete list, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how these three production platforms differ and also overlap. It might also help inform which electives you choose. So for instance, if I saw this chart back when I was studying chemical engineering, then I would definitely take electives that are related to tissue engineering if I wanted to do research in cultivated meats. Presently, there is a high demand for the right combination of scientific expertise and entrepreneurial spirit. But to build the alternative protein ecosystem, additional expertise is required. These are just some of the non-technical roles that are essential for the ecosystem at large. I've talked a bit about policy already, so I'll shout out a few other roles. So for example, as a nutritionist, you can help advise food scientists and engineers to make plant-based and cultivated meats healthier than conventional meat. Or as a scientific journalist, you can craft compelling narratives about alternative proteins that have a big influence on public perception and consumer acceptance. Now, I want to acknowledge that it can be difficult to forge your path in any emerging field. There's no doubting that. But nevertheless, it really is an exciting time to consider a career in alternative proteins. And that's because we're right in the sweet spot where you can find support and partners, but the ecosystem still has plenty of white space opportunities for you to explore. There's the potential for tremendous positive impact across many critical cause areas. Again, like public health, climate change, environmental justice, and global food security. And as an emerging industry, there's a greater chance of you becoming a leader in this field since you'll be one of the first. And along the way, you'll learn new things and be on the cutting edge of technology. And then lastly, if you're someone who thrives at the intersection of disciplines, then this is a fantastic area to be in. For instance, earlier this year, the European Space Agency hired a cultivated meat scientist to explore ways to produce food during long-term missions. So that sounds like a pretty cool job to me. Another question we get asked a lot is, what's it like to work at GFI? If you want to learn more about this, we have general hiring sessions just about GFI positions every other Wednesday. So kind of similar to this more general careers call, you can pose your questions ahead of time through the document that's linked on this slide. All right, and in this last section, I'm going to discuss how to build your career in the alternative protein field, and I'll offer various tips and resources. So to reiterate, I will be sharing these slides with you all. So you're going to see a bunch of links pop up. Don't worry about copying them down because you will get these slides. Now, when I describe alternative proteins as an emerging field or an emerging industry, what I mean is that it's at the intersection of several disciplines and it's a relatively new space. So preparing yourself for a career in a more traditional field, take software engineering, for example, that process can be a lot more straightforward because there are clear educational pathways through, computer science programs and boot camps, and there are professional societies and mentorship programs, and tons of textbooks and even books on preparing for the interview. But when it comes to emerging fields, the industry is still evolving, and the educational pathways into the field are literally being constructed as we speak. So as a result, it can feel very overwhelming to figure out what steps you need to take to set yourself up to enter either this space or really any emerging field. But fortunately, we can learn from experts in other emerging fields. This list of rules for training yourself in an emerging industry actually came from folks in the growing ecological forecasting space. So I'd like to walk through some of these steps and see how they can be applied to this field of alternative proteins. So rule number one that they recommend is to set your goals. This means asking yourself, why do you want to work in the alternative protein space? Like, what is actually motivating you? Are there particular research questions that excite you? Is there a certain company or organization you want to work for? Or is it something about the mission? Are you really passionate about environmental justice or animal welfare? And from there, what are the skills you need to either investigate these research questions or land your dream job? As a personal example, when I realized that I wanted to move from the pharmaceutical industry into the alternative protein nonprofit sector, I spent some time volunteering at a local nonprofit that was focused on food security so that I could learn more about how nonprofits operate compared to companies in the industry. The second rule they recommend is to leverage existing resources, both within and outside the emerging discipline. I've mentioned earlier that a lack of training resources and resources in general is a huge problem for emerging fields. But luckily, GFI aims to create these resources and make them open access. In the next few slides, I'll showcase some resources from GFI that are specific to the alternative protein field. So starting with resources for building your career. GFI maintains a career portal, which is an up-to-date listing of available positions in the alternative protein ecosystem. So this is definitely a great place to start, especially if you're graduating or maybe you're already working and you're looking to move into a full-time job now. On the webpage for the career portal, you'll also find a talent database that you can add yourself to. And this is a list that we share with startups who are looking to expand their teams. Another resource we have is this amazing interview series that profiles a variety of pioneering researchers in the alternative protein space. And we ask them how they entered this space, how their background came into play, what challenges they foresee. And they also offer plenty of advice for folks who are looking to join the future food movement. There's lots of great insight on how they leveraged their skill sets from other disciplines, and there's both representation from founders who spent decades in other industries, as well as researchers who jumped straight into the field after their undergraduate training. So definitely go get inspired and read this series. And then for all of you entrepreneurial spirits out there, we have a startup manual, which lays out the key steps for starting an alternative protein company. There's lots in here to learn from experts and entrepreneurs. So even if you're thinking about working at a startup, but not necessarily creating one, this guide could still be very useful. And then when it comes to navigating the field, you can check out our student guide, which is actually geared toward all newcomers to the alternative protein space, not just students. It is designed to help you navigate the various tools, communities, and databases available to you as you explore the alternative protein space. Then to get up to speed on the industry, you can learn from our State of the Industry reports, which cover the commercial landscape, investments, regulatory developments, and technological progress of the different production platforms. And then this last bundle of resources are resources for educating yourself about alternative protein science. I highly, highly recommend enrolling in GFI's free open access online course. After completing this course, there was at least one person that went on to create their own alternative protein startup. And others have even reported that they listed this course on their resume and that it helped them land a job in the industry. After you've completed that, we also have a course database that tracks various course offerings at universities and other institutions around the globe. So some of these courses are limited to university students, but a lot of these programs are open enrollment for anyone, and a lot of them are remote, so you can truly take them from wherever you're located in the world. So going back to rule number 2, I just listed some resources for within this emerging field of alternative proteins. You also want to take advantage of resources outside of this field, depending on what background you're coming from. So if you're trying to enter the alternative protein field from let's say a law background or a chemistry background, then take advantage of all of those resources for these more established fields, like join those professional societies and explore everything that they have to offer, because there's going to be just a much higher quantity of helpful content from these older fields. And then this brings me to rule number 3, which is when resources do not exist, help create them. GFI is a huge supporter of open access and open sharing. So if you want to create a resource for the field, we can help amplify it. And as an added bonus, you now have a concrete example of a contribution you made to the field that you can refer to as you network and apply for jobs. I'll share some examples. So creating educational resources is something many of you can do. Students from Johns Hopkins hosted a workshop on meat mimicry where they designed and led leg hemoglobin extraction experiments. And as a refresher, leg hemoglobin is a fermentation-derived ingredient that the Impossible Burger uses to give it that meaty appearance and taste. So the Johns Hopkins students, they hosted this workshop, and then they made these slides and lab protocols publicly available through GFI's curriculum repository, which allows educators to take these educational resources and run this experiment or workshop in their own classrooms. Another cool example is that students at Cambridge University are hosting an 8-week fundamentals program that anyone in the world can participate in. So links are here if you're interested either in enrolling, or if you're pretty familiar with the alternative protein field, you can actually apply to facilitate one of these groups. And so these are both examples of educational resources, but you can also build technical resources like short form tutorials on maybe a piece of lab equipment you use, or even resources to help other people build their careers. Rule number 4 is to attend workshops and conferences. Again, this should not just be limited to the alternative protein field, but to get started, you can visit gfi.org/events, and we post webinars and other events going on in the alternative protein space. For example, every month we have a Science of Alt Protein seminar, which is geared toward a technical audience and focuses on cutting edge research developments. We're actually having one of these seminars tomorrow where Dr. Michael Saad will present his research on cultivated mackerel cells. So you can still register for this event at gfi.org/events. We also have a Business of Alt Protein seminar series for a more commercially focused audience. And this covers topics related to starting and scaling a good food business. On Friday, Maureen McCusker from Blackhawk will be giving a talk on building startup teams. So you can also register for this event. And then in addition to checking our events page, there are many different mailing lists that you can join that are great about promoting conferences and seminars. So I recommend searching for those lists and signing up. So for example, there might be a mailing list that's specific to your country or your region, or maybe the production platform that you are most interested in. So if you want a more curated list, I would recommend taking that approach. The next tip they recommend is to join or help create a network that's specific to the emerging field. We have a few of these communities that are spun out of GFI. So for example, students should definitely check out the Alt Protein Project, which is a global student movement that's dedicated to turning universities into engines for alternative protein education, research, and innovation. We currently have 16 chapters in the US and throughout Europe and Israel. And you can visit this link to learn more about how you can start a chapter at your own university. And then also for students, but also for everyone else, whether you're an entrepreneur, scientist, subject matter expert, or something else, you are welcome to join our GF Ideas community, which is a really great place to network and connect with folks that are doing work that you might be interested in. Next rule is to find collaborators to work with and learn from. So obviously the communities I mentioned on the previous slide are excellent for finding potential collaborators, but here is one additional resource. Our collaborative researcher directory makes it easier for researchers to find collaborators with complementary skills. So in this directory, researchers indicate the kinds of collaborations that they're open to, whether it be with students or labs or companies. Many of these labs are hiring, and some folks in the directory list whether they're open to serving as mentors. So if someone sounds interesting, if their work sounds interesting, you can go ahead and reach out through their LinkedIn profile or ResearchGate profile that they provide in the directory. The next two rules are to learn the history and have a vision for the future. So here's one resource to help you get started with this. We have an initiative called Advancing Solutions for Alternative Proteins, or ASAP for short. And for this initiative, we conducted extensive research and interviews with over 150 experts across the alternative protein field to identify the highest priority areas and possible solutions. Taking some time to explore this database can help you contextualize the alternative protein field, and it can help you narrow down the contributions that you want to make in shaping the future of this movement. And then the last rules here are to measure your success, periodically reevaluate your goals and adjust your plan as needed. And then number 10, advocate for yourself. I'll leave it up to you all to check out this guide for more details. The link is at the bottom left corner here. Just to wrap this up, lastly, I wanted to share a couple more resources from other organizations that will also be helpful for planning your career. So firstly, there's 80,000 Hours, which is a London-based nonprofit that investigates which careers have the largest positive social impact, and they provide career advice based on their findings. And this is actually how I found my current role at GFI. So if you filter on their career portal by factory farming, this will include job postings in the alternative protein space. And then there's also Animal Advocacy Careers, which offers many detailed skills profiles for animal advocacy roles, including this one on technical research for animal product alternatives, AKA alternative proteins. Something cool to note is that both of these organizations, they do offer one-on-one calls for career advice. You just have to apply, and 80,000 Hours I know gets back to you in a week or two. And then you can also check out this career guide linked down here for ending factory farming, which was created by members of the alt protein community to bring it back to rule number 3. When resources don't exist, create them yourself. So that is it for the slides portion of this webinar. Thank you again for listening.